Can I grab I left my, sure. I was just going to grab my water.
Okay.
I'll be right back.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar today. We will begin in exactly 1 minute.
All good.
Wonderful. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Welcome to our third and final session in our series, Enhancing Mental Health Services for the Hispanic and Latinx Community. This is session 3, the intersection of mental health, immigration courts, and the Hispanic and Latinx community. This webinar is being co-sponsored by the Northeast and Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center in partnership with the Latino Mental Health Association of New Jersey. This webinar will be presented by Dr. Melissa Rivera Marano. Next slide, please. The MHTTC is funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, to enhance the capacity of the behavioral health and other related workforces to deliver evidence-based and empirical supported practices to individuals with mental illnesses. We ask that you please visit our website for more information at mhttcnetwork.org. Next slide, please. Again, if you're interested in attending any future training events that our center is sponsoring and hosting, we ask that you please subscribe to our mailing list, and we will share this link in the chat box. Next slide, please. And then following this webinar, you'll be asked to complete a brief survey. We value your feedback and use it to improve our activities and inform future activities. So these surveys are important because our continued funding is also linked to the completion of our surveys. So we thank you in advance for your feedback. Next slide, please. We also want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website, along with the PowerPoint presentation in the next 7 days. Next slide, please. This presentation was prepared for the Northeast and Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, or MHTTC, under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. All material appearing in this presentation, except that taken directly from copyrighted sources, is in the public domain and may be reproduced or copied without permission from SAMHSA or the authors. Citation of the source is appreciated. We ask that you please not reproduce or distribute this presentation for a fee without specific written authorization from the Northeast and Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. At the time of this presentation, Miriam Delphin-Rittman served as Acting Assistant Secretary for the Mental Health and Substance Use at SAMHSA. The opinions expressed herein are the views of the speakers and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services, or SAMHSA. No official support or endorsement of DHHS, SAMHSA, for the opinions described in this presentation is intended or should be inferred. Next slide, please. We encourage you to interact with our presenter during the webinar by using the chat feature. Please post any comments or questions you have in the chat, and I will collect your questions as we go and ask them of the presenter during the Q&A time toward the end of the presentation. During the webinar, our presenter may pose questions to you, so please use the chat feature to answer them. Next slide, please. The MHTTC network uses affirming, respectful, recovery-oriented language in all activities. This includes language that is strength-based and hopeful, language that is inclusive, accepting of diverse cultures, genders, perspectives, and experiences, language that is healing-centered and trauma-responsive, language that invites individuals to participate in their own recovery journey, language that is person-first and free of labels, language that is non-judgmental and avoids assumptions, and that is respectful, clear, and understandable and consistent with our actions, policies, and products. Next slide, please. Just as a reminder, that all participants today will receive a certificate of completion, a link to access the Zoom recording, and the presenter slides within 7 days of this webinar broadcast. Next slide, please. Also, we wanted to introduce the Latino Mental Health Association of New Jersey as our partners in this series, and they were founded in 1999 and is committed to addressing the mental health needs and well-being of the Latina, Latino, or Latinx communities by supporting mental health professionals across all disciplines through the advancement of training, treatment, research, mentorship, and advocacy. And then to this end, the association promotes, provides, and participates in ongoing interprofessional competence, interagency collaboration, and community engagement. Next slide, please. On your screen, you will see the Latino Mental Health Association of New Jersey social media handles. You can find them on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And if you're not a member, please use the QR code to join. Next slide, please. And I also wanted to share with you that the Latino Mental Health Association is also hosting upcoming events, such as a networking event and their annual conference. And their next conference will be held in February of 2023, and additional webinars and events that they also announce if you join. Next slide, please. Now let's begin our webinar. We have with us Dr. Melissa Rivera-Marano. Dr. Melissa Rivera-Marano obtained both her master's and doctorate degrees in clinical psychology from the Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology at Rutgers University. Dr. Rivera-Marano has provided assessment and therapy services as a licensed clinical psychologist since 2001. In addition to clinical services, during her career, she has worked as an administrator of a youth-based community organization and program researcher. Dr. Rivera-Marano is the owner of MRM Psychological Testing and Clinical Services, a group practice with 2 locations in Monmouth County, New Jersey. She is also a part-time lecturer for the Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology at Rutgers University. Dr. Rivera-Marano is on the medical staff at Monmouth Medical Staff and works as the psychologist on the interdisciplinary team for the Regional Newborn Extension Program. She is also published. Her publications, presentations, and research involve topics about Latinx mental health, cultural values, family and couples therapy, immigration, and assessment. Dr. Rivera-Marano is a former board trustee of NAMI New Jersey and former board member of the New Jersey Psychological Association Foundation of New Jersey. She is an active member of the National Latino Psychological Association, the New Jersey Psychological Association, and Monmouth and Ocean County Psychological Association. Dr. Rivera-Marano is also a member of the NJPA's Committee on Diversity and Inclusion Immigration Action Group. Currently, Dr. Rivera-Marano serves as the past president of the Latino Mental Health Association of New Jersey. Again, welcome everyone, and welcome to our presenter, Dr. Melissa Rivera-Marano, and I will turn over the webinar to her.
Hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here with everyone today. I'm aiming to cover topics that we could probably do, 2-day conference on, but hopefully the takeaway today will give everyone a nice foundation on the intersection between our undocumented immigrant population, mental health treatment and services, and our immigration court system. So the first thing I'll begin with is kind of that discussion or, moment to pause and say, well, why? Why do people make the decision to leave their native countries and come to the United States undocumented, without permission? There's a lot of terms that are used here, but why make the journey? What the slide in front of you does not cover everything, but it's basically what the research has told us are the categories where it falls most into. And I want to just bring your focus to the last, which is result of foreign policy decision, because that one really is integrated in the top three above it. So poverty hits to the individuals who leave their native country to the United States because they fall within their countries in a lower socioeconomic status. They are raised in poverty or living in poverty and are seeking to better their financial situation, quality not only for themselves, but oftentimes for their families. For those of you who've worked with this population, you can, I'm sure, think of examples of hearing the stories and hearing the reasons why the decision was made to come to the United States. Political instability would be one of the other key factors. And that, again, can be pretty diverse. So it's a kind of an umbrella term here, but that could be at the higher government level or local governments or legal structures. But these are individuals who are fleeing or leaving their countries, maybe due to war, maybe due to political unrest, maybe due to being targeted for reasons that may include different political affiliation, may include sexual orientation, may include religion. So these are the individuals that often also may fall into that category of seeking asylum. The other is financial crises, so a bit different than the poverty category. This is where maybe you have individuals who at one point were financially successful in their countries, able to meet the needs for themselves and their families. However, at a national level, the country is going through a financial crisis and they've lost all. And so these individuals then would be motivated to make that change and to try to come to the United States. So one of the things I wanted to get through today is a bit of a talk on policy. And we have a really long history of different policies and different dances in regards to immigration, depending on the administration, depending on what the United States position was, depending on the countries, the immigrants coming in. It varies and continues to vary. I'm really focusing on the most recent administrations just to give us a close, a little bit of a more recent look. I will also say this isn't my background, right? So I'm not a history, expert or policy expert, but I think in doing the work and working with this population, it's important to have at least a foundation of understanding as to what's going on the socio-political level and policy level, so that we have context, right, in understanding what's happening. So the Obama administration came in really with some interesting impact on immigration policy and what the landscape looked like in regards to deportation, as well as actions that allowed for a different type of possibility for undocumented immigrants. So I'll start with noting first that under the Obama administration, there was really a very high spike of deportations, largely due to an approach established, although talked about right from the beginning with the Obama administration, but established by 2014, that basically, identified undocumented immigrants who broke the law as deportable, and made that as kind of a focus group to attend to. And that happened. It did translate to a record large number of deportations with those parameters set even higher than recent previous administrations. But at the same time, the administration was also working towards a path towards a legalization or a path towards citizenship for undocumented immigrants. And that leads us to DACA. So with DACA, this became a policy that had the individuals, like it's a deferred action. So what it did was that it gave for, you had to meet certain criteria, which included having entered the United States before your 16th birthday. You had to be in school, a high school graduate, or honorably discharged from the military. You had to be under 31 years of age. not convicted of any felony or significant misdemeanor. So meeting all that criteria, this allowed for a deferred action for certain undocumented young people. The DACA allowed, once granted, 2 years of a DACA status, which allowed for some protections and allowed for some benefits, such as being eligible to have a work permit, be able to, again, renew. There was, again, by case basis, you'd still have to go through background checks, but it gave this population a status of being able to have somewhat of a temporary relief. So nothing permanent, but it was a temporary relief from deportation or removal proceedings. Now, DACA so we'll move through administration. So that was, it came in with Obama, and then during the Trump administration, very early on, it was discussed and talked about and really targeted. It was something that the Trump administration wanted to terminate. And in September of 2017, it enacted the termination of DACA, which, again, I'm going to say that for those of you who work with the population, this was a very high anxiety time. For those of us working, again, within the mental health field, it was not just anxiety producing for the individuals under DACA, but of course, for those who care and love them. And so, this was lots of questions, lots of uncertainties that all loaded up to this sense of insecurity. Now, in June 2020, the Supreme Court ruled that the administration really didn't follow proper procedure in ending the program, and thus it reenacted it. So the program came live again. The program was reinstated July 2020. However, there were still some things that didn't get reinstated. So they were no longer open for new applications. So it was reinstated for just for those who had been already awarded DACA. And also the limited protection, meaning that temporary relief, was now at an annual review versus every couple of years. So it shortened that time frame. Again, still kind of leaving a lot of anxiety about what was happening. Now, to finish just DACA up, because it's an important one and very kind of, present in our history of time. Under the Biden administration, DACA was looked at again. And in actuality, in the first day in office, Biden signed a memorandum to, in a sense, fortify DACA, which meant that they were open again. They were open for new applications. The renewal requests were for deferred action were being accepted. We were moving now along to 2 years again versus the 1 year. There was also, which had been stopped under the Trump administration, they were accepting applications for advanced parole documents. And what that is basically is an ability to travel. So as a DACA recipient, you're able to travel outside of the United States if you're given advanced parole documents. So that also came back into the picture. So these revisions, these are current now. These are getting it back to what it was with, again, some continued kind of discussion about where it may lead. Okay, so that's DACA. The other component as far as administrations goes, if we take a look at, again, most recent history and what's been happening, the Trump administration also executed a policy enhancing public safety in the interior of the United States, which in actuality really was an expansion of what Obama had in place, but the language of it became far broader. You'll see there's a whole list, right? So they refer to our undocumented population as aliens, and then go on. So convicted of a criminal offense, charged with, if a charge hasn't been resolved. So a whole bunch about criminal offenses, engaged in fraud or willful misrepresentation in connection with any official matter or application before a governmental agency. So I will say, I want to kind of focus on that one a little bit. That would include things like maybe somebody having a false ID. That could include maybe driving without a license, right? So the terminology here really opened it up and made it much broader. I'll jump to even the last part to kind of focus on, which was another component that really opened this up in regards to who was targeted, who could be detained, and who could be deported, or in the judgment of an immigration officer, otherwise pose a risk to public safety or national security. So in that language, it really left it to the immigration officer to kind of make the call. And really, regardless of where you were in the country, even states that view themselves as very progressive and somewhat immigrant friendly, there was a spike in the detention and deportation of individuals who were undocumented. So impact, right? So let's talk mental health impact here. We know that, and these are some quotes coming from the Washington Office on Latin America Human Rights Advocacy Group. The unauthorized immigrants will be looking over their shoulders and knowing that work is not a safe place. Enforcement environments making immigrants feel very vulnerable, very persecuted, afraid. And this also translated to being afraid to even go to local authorities if they were victims of a crime or if they needed to report, abuse. This environment, this culture translated to now our undocumented immigrants carrying additional fears and worries about what would happen to them. There was a case that I recall, I'm sure many of you do. What I don't recall is the name, so I apologize, but it made national news. And this was a woman who had presented to court to follow through on a restraining order for an abusive spouse, and instead was detained and identified for deportation. So this was happening during these years. The impact, the financial impact, right? So again, work, perhaps these work settings being identified as potential settings where there were undocumented immigrants, they began to get raided. And so, the insecurity of work, the loss of jobs, the fear associated with putting yourself out there to work, having then its financial impact. The familial impact, again, I mentioned before, the worry, the anxiety, the fear, as well as the impact if you had a loved one detained, deported. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. And all of that obviously giving us this psychological profile here of loss, anxiety, and trauma. So I'm not going to play, well, this one I think I'm going to play whole because this one's not too long, but I'm going to, at this point, try to share this video because again, this reflects this period of time that we were talking about with the previous administration. So, this video I think is a nice little kind of summary, although, it's unfortunate, but I think most of us have been exposed to a greater detail of images and stories and have heard it, direct as to what happened during this time. I mean, currently there's still, I think a couple of hundred or just under children whose families were never able to connect them to their parents. And so the impact on this, on these children and their families is not just this moment in time, right? But the impact is greater. And I would even say the societal impact is greater too, to have witnessed what happened during that period. For those who kind of wonder what used to happen, just generally speaking, kids were kept with their parents, with the adults that they were traveling with, and kept at these types of detention centers. It was really the involvement of the federal detainment for these parents that really created that what we saw, that level of separation. And so these are just, again, a few quotes. The American Psychiatric Association, the American Pediatric Association, the American College of Physicians, all put out statements in regards. I mean, many of our agencies did the same, but these are just a few quotes here that I'll share with you. And I don't think of those of you who work in the mental health, you're going to find any of these surprising, right? Any forced separation is highly stressful for children and can cause lifelong trauma. and as well as increased risk of other mental illnesses, depression, anxiety, PTSD. The lifetime impacts of behavioral problems and mental health is also something that interfaces and interacts with the person's physiology, right? So we have increased risk then for chronic illness. And so what we look at this, and again, from a health perspective, as quoted by Dr. Ana Maria Lopez, from a health perspective, this approach is really hurtful and damaging to families, not just now, but long-term as well. Just a current policy recent, just to throw this in so you guys can get a feel of something that's happening now. And again, things, some things move super, super slow. And sometimes, our country sometimes moves very slow for change, and at other times is super reactive. But right now, the most recent policy has to do with the asylum office, really trying to address the backlog and the waiting time for asylum cases to be seen, where the Biden administration has now, it's going to be effective May 31st, will have identified court officers, immigration court representatives identified as individuals who will be able to make decisions regarding asylum cases, thus putting less burden on the immigration judges who are completely backed up. There's litigation about this and there's lawsuits about this already, but this is kind of what's happening most current in regards to policy. This is also a quickie reference slide. We're talking about Department of Homeland Security, so I thought it would be a good reference for everyone to know how that's broken down. So the Department of Homeland Security is broken down by 3 branches. USCIS is U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, ICE, which is U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and CBP, which is U.S. Customs and Border Protection. So when we think about immigration services, permanent residents, the courts kind of applying and processing applications, naturalizations, asylum, all of that is under USCIS. In a sense, some of the judicial kind of components are there. But now when it comes to enforcement, investigations, that's ICE, and anything border related is the Customs and Border Protection. Okay. So now that we've got that foundation underway, I'm going to introduce you to how our undocumented population intersects with the immigration courts through types of applications. So these applications are all applications that the undocumented individual is seeking to put forth in order to have some resolution to their status in the United States, right? The goal is to be able to get some type of legal presence in the United States, and these are some of the means in which they are able to access that. There is the T visa. I'm going to go through each. The U visa, VAWA, spousal abuse, also known as VAWA, asylum cases, extreme hardship cases, and then the last are the medical certification for disability exceptions. I'm going to spend more time on some than others. And of course, just to remind you all that as I'm going through it, please jot down your notes and your questions and put them in so that we can have a nice discussion afterwards. So the T visa is a temporary immigration benefit. So this is not something that's definitive, but it enables certain victims of severe form of trafficking, as well as eligible immediate family members to remain in the United States for an initial period of 4 years. And again, there's components of this that must be met. They would have had to comply with a reasonable request for them to assist with law enforcement in the detection, investigation, prosecution of human trafficking, or qualify for an exemption or exception. The T visa does allow for employment authorization, and so that you're able to get your work permits. And you also will have opportunity to make this temporary status into a more permanent one, such as with legal residency and obtaining a green card. So in October 2000, as part of the Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act, this T visa came into play. So human trafficking, trafficking of persons, is described as a form of modern day slavery in which traffickers use force, fraud, coercion to compel individuals to provide labor or services, including commercial sex. Traffickers take advantage of vulnerable individuals, including those lacking lawful immigration status. So the T visa was to offer protection to victims and strengthen the ability of law enforcement agencies to get the perpetrators to detect, investigate, and prosecute human trafficking. Severe trafficking is described under two categories: sex trafficking and labor trafficking. When someone recruits, harbors, transports, provides, solicits, patronizes, or obtains a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act, where the commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or the person who's induced to perform such an act is under 18 years of age. Labor trafficking is when someone recruits, harbors, transports, provides, obtains a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, coercion for the purpose of involuntary servitude, personage, debt, bondage, or slavery. The eligibility for the T visa is as follows. So for individuals to submit an application for the T visa and to be found eligible, they do need to meet the criteria of that previous slide of a severe form of trafficking, of having been a victim of, present in the United States when that, or port of entry related to the trafficking. As I mentioned before, complying with law enforcement agencies in the investigation or prosecution. Also demonstrating that they would suffer extreme hardship involving unusual and severe harm if they were removed from the United States, and that they're admissible to the United States. So that's basically, things like there's no, significant criminal record, that type of thing. So again, here I'll take a pause, and share just a quick example of one of my first trafficking cases, which actually came through me through a different means. So I had been asked, so this individual was involved with the Department of Children and Families here in New Jersey, really due to kind of homelessness and some DV with a partner. They had a young child, and the division had been called numerous times. The child wasn't removed. However, due to the division being called numerous times, the person was sent for a psychological evaluation. Came to find through getting the history and clinical interview that this mother had really been recruited in Mexico. So she had described that there was an American business owner who had gone, she was in the Cancun area, is where she had worked. And he had set up some kind of meetings to introduce individuals there to work in life in the United States, really kind of a recruitment type process. And so come to find out, I'll kind of make a long story short, there were false documents and all involved with this. He created documents for them that were not true documents to bring them to the United States. They were then brought to a farm up in the New England area, a chicken farm, where she made, I think she said just over $3 an hour, and was housed in a home with other women like her working. They would have lights out at a certain time. They would all have to begin their day when told. And she escaped that with another woman. The happy story with this is that having told me her story, I was able to connect her with, as well as the division helped out with this significantly, connect her with the right resources and connections for representation in order to seek a T visa, because she absolutely met criteria. So, in the course of our work, sometimes we can come across, a history, a story that that reflects these type of experiences. So for the T visa, again, we have the whole trafficking component of it as defined by what I shared before. And then we move to a U visa. So with a U visa, the individual, the immigrant, has suffered mental or physical abuse, being a victim of a certain criminal activity that is occurring here in the United States. So the criminal activity, they have to be a victim here, and the crime has to have occurred here. And that the individual is able to provide information in the prosecution of the perpetrator, so that they have information concerning the criminal activity that investigators are able to use. And again, kind of meeting the criteria of making sure that they're eligible, but they're looking for that cooperation as well as the identification of them being victimized here. Sorry about that one. We have the Violence Against Women's Act, and as a battered spouse, child, or parent, an immigrant visa petition may be filed. It is amended for the Violence Against Women Act, which allows U.S. citizens, certain spouses, children of permanent residents to file a petition for themselves without the abuser's knowledge. So this basically allowed the victims to seek safety and independence for the abuser, who's not notified about the filing. And for the undocumented population, they are able then to present this as a case for them to separate safely from their abuser and be protected. So in this case, for example, one of the cases that I was involved with had a woman who was married to a US citizen who was abusive to her, and history with domestic violence, history of contacting the police, and really had held over her this threat that she was going to get deported, that he was going to call ICE on her. It was an ongoing threat because her status was not yet resolved here, even though she was married to the US citizen. And so that was somebody who fell under this category in this type of intersection. So now we're moving on to asylum, which I think is one of the ones that most people either feel that they're familiar with or are very familiar with. So asylum, or at least the legal definition of it, is a legal protection from deportation sought by the non-US citizen entering the US. And either whether they're entering legally or illegally, but they're seeking asylum. So they're asking for refuge based on claims of persecution or fear of persecution in their home country. Now, sometimes people get also confused or not sure about, well, what's a refugee and what's the difference between an asylum seeker and a refugee. So refugee already has the status of refugee, meaning that if you're identified as a refugee, the United States is already identifying you as somebody who is going to be protected and fall under this category. For example, the United States is allowing Ukrainian refugees in, right? So they have that label or that descriptor already. Someone who is an asylum seeker may get the title of refugee in their process, but they are coming in not having that automatically. So they are an asylum seeker. So in seeking asylum, individuals will come for different reasons. It may be political persecution. And again, as I said before, when we were talking about reasons for coming to the United States, and we mentioned the political persecution could mean, you're on the wrong side of those in power. You are a community organizer. And again, those in power have targeted you. You may be someone representing a religion that is not the religion of power or the religion of authority in your area, and thus targeted. the case has been made also for in certain countries for there to be, a gender-related persecution, sexual orientation. So if you're targeted, within the LGBTQ transgender communities, that could also fall under there. Exposure to criminal activity. So the asylum seeker may be someone who has been targeted by organized crime, or either to recruit or to have them be actively, or again, to target them in order to get monies or to have them do things. Some of these, I will say, while they're listed here, have been successful in achieving asylum and some have not. It can vary here because there have been cases where there's been a pushback, for example, for individuals seeking asylum from countries where gang affiliation and gang power has been one of the main reasons why they've left. So they're proof, in a sense, of having to show why they were persecuted, why they had to leave, why they were fleeing. They've had to provide much more evidence there to make the case. Racial persecution, in any of these asylum cases, we're asking the following. Are they afraid? So again, either as a treating clinician or as an evaluator for an asylum case, there is a mental health psych component that gets put in the mix of these asylum cases when these applications are being put forth. So the question is the applicant afraid for their life if they're forced to return to the country of origin? And then conversely, the other question that we've got to, rule in or rule out, is the applicant suffering some type of mental health illness, some psychotic processes, which is having them fear return, and there really isn't a fear. So that's one of the things kind of the courts or the immigration courts wants us to clarify when we're providing an opinion on an asylum seeker's case and mental state. When we're looking at the mental health kind of diagnostic profile, we're looking at individuals that have been psychologically traumatized. They may have been exposed to one or more torture, intimidation, physical and/or sexual violation, unlawful incarceration, harassment, assault, battery, rape, disfigurement. Okay, they are victims. The most common, thus not surprisingly, is really a trauma manifestation. Diagnostically, whether that's a PTSD, acute stress disorder, anxiety disorder, severe major depressive disorder. But we are really seeing individuals who have experienced significant trauma and who are presenting with trauma-related symptoms. I'm going to play a little bit of this. This is a little bit of a longer one, but it's just to kind of take a little pause to take a look at, again, the individuals who are seeking asylum and why they're seeking asylum. And these are within our Latinx community. This is our trans community.
Did your identities have anything to do with your journey to the United States?
Sí, claro. Yo creo que y la discriminación y todo eso y la violencia, crímenes de odio que hay en nuestro país, por todo esto también es que salimos huyendo prácticamente de la comunidad LGBTI, de sufrir la discriminación, violencia en nuestro país y venir a volver a lo mismo.
This is a story of what it's like to be a trans Latinx migrant in the United States today.
Este es el centro de Eloy.
Yeah, so there is detainees right outside. It's a journey of fleeing violence and seeking refuge in a country that can be unwelcoming.
Y en cuanto pisas ese lugar, empiezan los maltratos físicos, psicológicos, verbales, emocionales, de toda clase de abusos que te puedas imaginar. Y por parte de oficiales y por parte de detenidos.
No es tan fácil venir de nuestros países, creo que todas hemos pasado muchos retos. Todo eso aguantamos para sobrevivir y por querer tener una vida mejor
we're gonna keep fighting this, we're gonna keep transmigrating, we're gonna keep transgressing borders, and we're not gonna stop.
I'll pause that there. So one of my first, sorry, get this over here. One of my first cases, actually, one of my first immigration related cases was of an individual who had come fleeing his country. He identified as queer and had experienced real targeted attacks because he had had a relationship with the son of the local law enforcement. When this was found, he was beaten and threatened, and so fled his town overnight, making his way over to the city or to one of the more urban areas, had a few contacts there, and really was trying to figure out how he was going to, kind of live and survive, having had to leave everything behind from his town and needing to figure this out, but thinking, okay, I'm in an urban area, I may be able to make this work. However, after a few short months there, because this person was somebody who was in authority, like I mentioned before, from law enforcement, they continued to look for him. And he was spotted and identified, beaten again, and threatened. And it was at that point where the family had made, he wasn't out to all of his family, but he was out to his sister and his, while not out to his mother was supportive and knew that bad things were happening to him. They made a quick plan to get him out of the country. And that was one of the first cases that I had worked on. And I don't always find out the results of these cases through the courts. I don't always get information on it, but as one of the first, the attorney did reach out and let me know that this individual's application was successful and he had been granted asylum. So moving from asylum, which I think, in our field, if we're asked to provide either as therapist or evaluator, some type of opinion or documentation or support for somebody's application, I would say that the next really most common are extreme hardship evaluations. The extreme hardship evaluation, I'm going to spend a bit of time on this because, again, it does come up very often, and it does come up both for evaluators as well as treating therapists. So we're really looking at the impact of the immigrant's deportation on the US citizen, permanent resident, parent, spouse, or child. With that being said, although they're the primary focus, meaning the US citizen or the legal resident, family member, loved one, we also do take a look and spend some time understanding the individual putting the application through, because impact to them will also mean impact to their family, right? So if there's significant concern about mental health or other issues like that, it of course will not only be stressful and difficult if there's a separation and a deportation to the individual, but also to their family and love members. So one of the things that is kind of talked about under extreme hardship are kind of common consequences. And basically it's to understand that common consequences, and that's, I'm going to kind of almost say that in air quotations, although you can't see me, means that, things that we would typically expect if somebody gets separated from a family member is not on its own warranting of a finding of extreme hardship. However, they do look at it cumulatively. So for example, the consequence of a family separation, they're going to feel sad, it's going to be difficult, it's going to be traumatizing, there's going to be attachment issues, all the things that we can connect to that. There's a case to be made for it, but it's not the only. So what they really look for extreme hardship cases is really to tell the full story. So we look at, yes, impact of family separation, impact of your finances, what the impact will be to this family if there's a forced deportation, separation. What is the difficulty of readjusting to life in a new country if the US citizen family, legal resident family member is made to, if we're talking about a minor, if they must go now to a country they don't know because their parents have been deported. The educational opportunities, what's the impact for these perhaps these US citizen children, medical services and facilities in that country, impact on employment. So again, not any of these on their own, but cumulatively, that's the story that we're looking at. That's the understanding that we want to give as practitioners when we're asked to provide information for these cases. So I'm going to go through these, and you guys will have these slides, so I'm not going to read through each and every, because you'll have this as a reference. But again, because extreme hardship is such a common type of evaluation, therapist kind of input type of component of these applications, I wanted to make sure that we had some good information on it. So again, as we talked about the different branches, the USCIS is in charge of kind of making determinations, right? These different applications come in, they're going to make a determination on whether the application is accepted or not. These are some of the things that they'll look at. Our end, we fall under that mental health documentation and evaluations by licensed professionals, right? Medical or mental health. They'll get documents, official documents, they'll get affidavits. So they'll ask for community members to write letters of support or histories of in regards to the individuals. They'll ask for evidence, right, depending on what we're talking about and what our concerns are. If part of the concern is returning to this country would mean a risk to self due to the high rate of violence, due to the targeting of individuals who are coming from the United States, then there needs to be some type of evidence supporting that. And that may come from newspaper reports, that type of thing. Family ties and impact they're going to consider. So again, what is the impact on the relative that is, going to be separated from the individual who is deported? Can they access them? Do they have access to visit them, to travel? Is there money there? Is there availability for them to maintain that relationship through travel? What if the individual is a minor and must go with the parent? What is the impact educationally for that child? What if they have medical concerns? What is the treatment going to be there? How are they going to be able to access that? All of that is included. If the individual has characteristics that may be targeted in the host country, what will that impact be to have them go back there? Where are their ties? Do they have anyone in that country anymore? Do they have any resources over there? Are they really left to kind of have, do they have nothing there and no identified supports? There's again, there's consideration in all of these. Again, like I mentioned before, this is all cumulative, right? So if you had to be involved in the court system, let's say you have court dates coming up, let's say you provide child support, there's ties basically here in the United States. So what will a deportation do to your family member if you have to go with them, or if they're no longer here? How does that impact your ability to follow through with these things? Again, one of the things that has come up, for example, on, why, let's just say the question, why would it be difficult for, this spouse to go to Guatemala with their spouse if their spouse is deported? Perhaps the spouse doesn't speak Spanish. Perhaps the spouse has a job here. Perhaps the spouse has all their family and connections here. So all of those things get considered as we're talking about impact, right? Impact and hardship. Economic, both ways, right? So economic for a lot of the families that I see when we look at the economic impact, many of them do not have additional resources in their native country. And so a deportation there is not a deportation going back to assets, home, land, right? Many times they have nothing there. And so the economic impact of having to start completely anew in often countries where employment is not easy, and finances, being able to, finance yourself as well as your family, is a large primary reason why the individual came to the United States. And so that's one component. And when we're talking about families, oftentimes we're talking about the loss of income, loss of a primary income provider. And so then we have impact on, for example, the spouse. And if the spouse is to remain with US citizen children, now the spouse maybe who was not working now must work. The spouse now must manage, childcare and cost of childcare. So the financial impact is significant. And also what's happening in the native country, that's also part of the considerations that are brought up in these applications. Identifying also, and this again goes for the therapist, the treating provider, as well as the evaluator, taking the time to really get a good understanding of the family system and what their needs are. So if there are identified health conditions where you need medication management, whether there's mental health histories that need treatment, whether there's a history of mental health, perhaps even significant major depressive episodes where the individual who would have to be deported, or the family member as well, would potentially have risk due to previous history of having that presentation surface again. And how will they treat it in that native country? Will they have access? So are all questions that need to be addressed in these cases. So what do we need to know? Would the deportation of the immigrant pose an extreme hardship to the relative in question? Would it be an extreme hardship for the lawfully resident relative to accompany the immigrant back to his or her home country, right? These are the areas we're talking about. Are we looking at these questions across the domains, financial, educational, healthcare, psychological, are all these factors being considered, and an understanding that our families represent, a complex web of interdependencies. And so as things are happening and being identified, related to one, we know that there is going to be that impact on other. I'm going to share this video with you.
Right here is where Beatrice, a mother of 4, was pulled over on her way home from work on a Sunday afternoon by the Highway Patrol and questioned about her legal status. This is a mom who's been here since she was 17 years old, almost 20 years.
Cuando se lo dijimos a los niños empezaron a llorar todos. Todos lloraron. Me decían que por qué si los policías están para ayudar, que por qué les quitaban a su mamá.
On July 23rd, Betty Casillas, an undocumented mother of 4, was pulled over in a routine traffic stop. She couldn't produce a driver's license, so she was sent to jail and deported to Mexico the following week. Her children waited at home for her to return for dinner. They haven't seen her since.
¿Cereal o quieres cuernito?
So I'm actually going to pause it there. These videos obviously are going to be here for reference when you get the PowerPoint, but I just want to kind of take a pause maybe with this right now and think about what the little glimpse of what we just saw. Mom goes out, mom doesn't return. Mom is in Mexico within the week. The impact on these families is deep, it's traumatic, and it has layers. we can immediately respond to the emotion part of this, just the idea of not having a parent and what the kids are experiencing and trying to understand what the stressors are for this father now who has been thrown into a position of single parenthood with the uncertainties of what's happening with his wife and how he can support her and support the children, right? So we can respond to the emotional components of this. But as we were just looking at and talking about before, we can also understand that there's several layers. The cost, related to this father, trying to make his case to get his wife back, the cost potentially of, treatment services for himself or for his children, the financial impact of him having to have, now as a single parent for sure that, paying for childcare. And we can go on and on, but it, in a moment, right? In a moment, we can see the impact of a separation for this family that is going to have, lifelong effects. So the last area, and this is a quickie, but the other area where we in the mental health field may be called in have to do with medical exception requirements. So these are our individuals who are in a process of applying, or perhaps they are, or even at the level of trying to seek citizenship. So these are our immigrant populations who are presenting with either physical, developmental, or mental impairment that is blocking them from being able to comply or meet requirements in this application process. And so a formalized evaluation is done, and based on that, recommendations are made for accommodations and recommendations in order for the individual to be able to proceed. And I know I'm taking a quick look at the time. I know we're almost there. So I'll just speak to, this was kind of going to be a little bit of an open discussion anyways, having an understanding of all the ways that our Latinx population can intersect with the immigration courts, and in what ways for us as providers, therapy providers and evaluators, we may be called to provide opinions or information and records. We also have the part of our treatment, right? So as an evaluator, it may not be something that you're doing ongoing, like a treating provider would do, but these are all still areas that we want to make sure that we're covering when we have these individuals in the room with us. We want to have an understanding of their lives in their native country. We want to have a respect for that because, one of the things that I've noted too, to really be sensitive to and careful with is that, there's a lot of times in these type of applications, this need to really paint their countries in the most negative terms, right? So that they're fearful, they're fleeing, there's gangs, there's corruption, whatever that may be, that is a reality to their application, but it's also the countries they're born in, the countries that, their families' roots are in. It's the memories that they have and the smells and the traditions and the experiences that they have with family and with friends that also have value. And so I try to be very careful in leaving a space for that and a space for the individual to explore that as well. We always want to have an understanding of the why, right? Why the decision to take this step and to make this journey, and how, right? So we want to have a sense of that as well. And then getting, to the questions of, okay, you're here. What's here looking like? What's life in this country like for you? How are you navigating language and work and finances and connection to your family? Whether that be reconnection, right? So you may have had family that's been here for years. I've seen that plenty of times with adult children reconnecting with a parent who came to the United States when they were children, and as well as losses, right? Because this is part of the story as well. And then, of course, assessing emotional functioning so that we can best treat, guide, and provide recommendations for the individuals that we're seeing. So just a couple of quotes, and I think we'll leave it, and then we'll get to our question and answer. They have no idea what it is like to lose home at the risk of never finding home again. Have your entire life split between two lands and become the bridge between two countries. So here you are, too foreign for home, too foreign for here, never enough for both. References are at the back, and I guess I will stop my share here. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rivera Marano, for providing us with such detailed information in this very specific topic area in mental health as it intersects with someone's legal status in this country, in the US. So I wanted to move on to some questions. Now, at this time, I invite the audience, because we do have ample time for questions, to enter them either in the chat box or in the Q&A pod. In the meantime, I will also just share the survey link in case anybody would like to fill the survey while they're listening. I just included it in the chat box. And so I have a few questions that came to mind, and maybe we can have a conversation and expand on this topic area. And someone brought up in the chat box ACEs, because as you know, with the foundation of the Adverse Childhood Experiences study done by Kaiser Permanente, I don't think it had a lot touched upon this area of childhood trauma, which is either separation, either at the border, or just the migratory experience of itself. Even if it's someone who didn't have that very traumatic, impactful experience, but just the migratory, the acculturation process, being bicultural, being of a dual world. Maybe I just wanted to get maybe your take on it. Do you see that it poses someone at risk of having more increased trauma experience if they come from a situation where they underwent many changes, maybe abrupt changes, and so it might lead to more like an increased risk factor, if you will?
Yeah. I mean, I think that one of the things that we understand, in regards to attachment theory and loss, is that when we have a number of that happen, right? So if we're thinking about, I'll think about it just I'll give you kind of a developmental kind of answer. So when you think about a child having experienced a lot of change with potential caretaker, environment, and along with that loss, which is part of some of our stories. These migrational stories are also ones that not only include the child who leaves their native country to come here, but it also includes the child who's left behind and then maybe comes later to meet a parent that they don't really know very well. There's, again, I say this could be, forget weekend, it could probably be a whole full week conference and talk, because, all of those variabilities are our truths. These are what we hear. These are the stories we hear. These are the histories that are provided. These are the realities. And every time I think that we look at that, of course, there's going to be associated risk to that. And I will say that there's buffers, something that our literature has continued to say, and it is something that is within our culture, is family, meaning it's connectedness. And connectedness, we know, again, through the psychological literature, is something that allows us to have somewhat more resiliency. So a child who's going through changes, but has adults along the way who they know they can count on, who they feel secure with along those changes, are going to have some buffers. Doesn't mean that they're not at elevated risk, again, because it's change and it's trauma, but those are also children who have buffers. So it's not a black or white, it's a whole bunch of shades of gray, but they're all truths to all the challenges that we have in working with our families and getting them to healthier places. It's that acknowledgement and needing to spend that time in understanding that history of loss and change for them.
Absolutely. And that possibly interventions and a recovery plan or a care plan has to be very tailored and nuanced to their specific needs of a particular person, whether it's a child or an adult. I also wanted to introduce maybe the concept of, I know right now there's a lot of talk about trauma-informed practices, trauma-informed care. How would you maybe see having a foundational knowledge of the legal system and the person's legal status as a way of enhancing trauma-informed care to not so much foster resilience, because I feel like resilience is always spoken about as, oh, a child is always resilient, but at the same time talking about preventing those traumatic experiences or addressing those traumatic experiences, so we don't always have to rely on resilience, so we don't always have to re-traumatize. So have you encountered a lot of this, the intersection of trauma-informed care and the undocumented community? Or
Yeah, I
refugees?
mean, yeah, I think that there's a few points in kind of what you bring up. You know, I think part of something that is important with whatever modality we're utilizing and working and addressing trauma is that we allow some flexibility in the approach so that we can, again, have a treatment and a plan and an approach that is not the patient fitting the treatment, but is the treatment fitting the patient. And one of the things I think in working with this population, I use the word space a lot because I think the pace of sometimes the pace with our approaches can be very kind of dictated. And I've found in my experience in working with the population that it can be somewhat of a slower process. There's a lot that is held in for a while. They go kind of where they're able to, and I understand that it's protective. They go where they can go in that moment. And so I think for the clinician, so just as far as a clinical mind and approach and trauma-based and or whatever other trauma modality you're using, I think one thing that I've found in practice is that I really kind of leave it much more fluid and open in working with these populations in order to go at their pace. Now, with that being said, something that you brought up was like kind of that understanding of what's going on legally for them. And if they are involved with the courts, is it important for me as a treating clinician to have at least a good grasp of that? I really do think it is. Some of it is for advocacy. Some of it is to make sure that your patient actually understands what they're in. They're not always as informed. They may be meeting with an attorney. That doesn't mean they're well informed. So that I think is very important, and that can also help with the bonds with the patient. The other also is to be able to connect with those types of stressors that are real life happening now, and not bring if you are not informed, the patient may not bring it to the room. You have individuals also who are very nervous about talking about their undocumented status. And even if they're in the process and kind of in quotes doing everything right, they put their application in there, they're still kind of anxious about talking about it. And so if you're not bringing it to them, you may never allow that to be present, which, I think would be a disservice to them.
Absolutely. Thank you. And then my final question in this topic area is about shame. There's some kind of, when I used to meet with clients in my other career, I heard a lot about this. I felt bad, I felt shame, but I think I wanted to know what is it a combination of both the internalized messages or internalizing the shame that's assigned to someone having to go through a hardship in the migratory process, or combination of both?
So, I'm thinking at my cases too, as you brought that up, and kind of seeing what comes up for me. And I guess I had two kind of examples that come up. One, where that presence of shame that hit right on the mark with what you were saying as far as that internalized message. That sense of, maybe I am less than, right? I really don't belong here. So yeah, I think that comes up, and that comes up for some individuals. The other way it's come up is shame around their reason, meaning I'm thinking about my asylum and some of even my VAWA victims. So the individuals who part of their case and part of their process is their victimization. I've also seen it presented there where they're carrying a sense of shame in their history of being victimized. And then, and like most, we're in a tough, our judicial system, asks our victims to tell their story over and over and over again, and so it's a tough process for them. And that's another place where I've seen it brought up. I will also say, because now I've been at this for a long time, and I also, I always think of both sides of everything. And I also think of my, again, the individuals that have come through the door who's we're still pretty proud, connected, and have a really clear vision of their role here and what they want for their lives and their future in this country. And so they're there too, right? So we want to always capture that we have that diversity in the individuals going through these processes for sure.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So at this time, I'm going to share our slide with our evaluation QR code. So just so that everyone is aware. Okay, so on your screen, you will see a QR code that will lead you to complete our brief survey about today's webinar event. This, again, a lot of our funding is linked to the survey completion, so we really encourage you to share your feedback with us. Also, we wanted to share that we do have a podcast on Spotify, Apple Music, and Podbean. It's called Flourishing at Work Toward Wellness and Recovery, and it's our podcast channel. So if you have a moment, please take a look at that if it resonates with you. I also wanted to share our contact information here at our center. But most importantly, I wanted to also thank the Latino Mental Health Association of New Jersey as our sponsors in this series. I want to thank Dr. Melissa Rivera Morano for being our presenter today. We have such wonderful feedback in the chat box. So many of you have shared that this touched upon many key points in working with the Latino, Latina, Latinx population. And we want to acknowledge, all of the work that everyone is doing to provide the best services for people within this population. Do you have any closing remarks, Dr.
Yeah, no, I want to just say thank you for having me. And I was, happy to represent also the Latino Mental Health Association of New Jersey in presenting this webinar. My hope is that, the goal was that everyone would leave a bit more informed, on some of the foundational stuff out there with immigration and courts, and that we continue the good work, right?
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So with that being said, I want to just wish everyone a wonderful afternoon. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to contact us. I'll share my email in the chat box. And as a reminder, because I know this comes up a lot, everyone within 7 days will receive a link to our webinar recording, a link to view the presenter slides in PDF format, and a certificate of completion for 1.5 hours of professional development. Zero cost to you. So we hope to see you at our upcoming training events, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.